There's something most people don't know about Danzo Shimura, and it starts long before he ever reached for power. Danzo wasn't some outsider who crept into Konoha's history. He was there almost from the beginning, standing among the founding generation of the Hidden Leaf. As a young shinobi, he trained under the second Hokage, Hashirama Senju, alongside another boy his own age named Hiruzen Sarutobi. The two of them were teammates, learning the same lessons, fighting the same enemies, shaped by the same teacher. And that shared beginning matters, because everything that later divided them grew out of that single classroom. To understand Danzo, you first have to understand Tobirama, and here's where it gets interesting. Tobirama is remembered as a brilliant, forward-thinking leader, the man who built many of Konoha's core institutions. But he was also a hard realist. He believed a village could not survive on ideals alone, that it needed to be protected from the shadows, quietly, by people willing to do the things no one else would. To make that real, Tobirama founded the Unbu, the village's secret operatives who worked in darkness so the village could live in light. Danzo absorbed that lesson completely, but where Tobirama saw the shadows as one tool among many, Danzo saw them as the answer to everything. He took his teacher's idea and pushed it to its most ruthless extreme. So the seed of Danzo's entire philosophy wasn't his own invention. It was planted by the very Hokage who trained him. That's the surprising part most fans overlook. Danzo didn't rebel against Konoha's founders. He believed he was the one truly carrying out what Tobirama had started, protecting the leaf by any means necessary, even the ugly ones. Now, back to those two teammates, Danzo and Hiruzen. As they grew older, both men rose through the ranks, and both were considered for the same position, the title of Third Hokage. This is the moment that quietly defined the rest of Danzo's life. Two rivals from the same generation, equally loyal to the village, both waiting to see who would be chosen. And when the decision finally came, it was Hiruzen who was named Third Hokage, not Danzo. That single choice changed everything. Because Hiruzen led with an open hand, guided by compassion and by the will of fire, Danzo came to believe the village needed someone to balance that softness, someone to make the cold calculations a kind Hokage never could. So he stepped into the role of the man who acted where the Hokage couldn't, operating in the background, convinced that his rival's mercy would one day get the leaf destroyed. In Danzo's mind, he wasn't betraying Hiruzen. He was completing him. But what's really surprising comes next, because this rivalry wasn't an accident of the plot. It was engineered. Masashi Kishimoto, the creator of Naruto, designed Danzo very deliberately as a foil to Hiruzen. Think about how carefully the two are matched. Same generation, same teacher in Tobirama, the same deep loyalty to Konoha. But everything about their methods runs in opposite directions. Hiruzen forgives, Danzo eliminates. Hiruzen trusts the next generation, Danzo controls it. One leads in the daylight, the other works in the dark. Kishimoto built them as two halves of a single idea, so that together they embody the light and the shadow of the exact same village. And once you notice that design, Danzo stops being a simple villain. He becomes the answer to a question the story keeps asking. What does it actually cost to keep a peaceful village safe? Hiruzen represents the price paid in ideals. Danzo represents the price paid in blood and secrecy. Neither one alone is the whole truth of Konoha, which is why Kishimoto needed both men to exist side by side. There's one more detail that ties Danzo's legacy together, and it hides in plain sight, right inside his name, Shimura. It's easy to pass over, but that surname carries the weight of everything he stood for. Danzo raised Sai, the pale young operative, within his secret organization, shaping him into one of the Foundation's quiet weapons. So even beyond his name, his influence stitched itself across generations, binding him to the children shaped by his methods long after he was gone. That's the shape of the man before the story truly tests him. a teammate of the third Hokage, a student of Tobirama's harshest ideas, a rival who lost the one title he wanted and spent the rest of his life convinced that loss made him necessary. Every piece of Danzo's origin points in the same direction, toward the shadows Tobirama first described. But Danzo didn't just admire those shadows. He built something inside them, a place with no name that outsiders were never meant to see, where children were remade into weapons and emotion was treated as a flaw to be erased. To understand what Danzo truly became, we have to step quietly into that hidden world, a place called Root. What very few people realize is that Root wasn't simply a darker branch of the Anbu. In Japanese, it's called ne, a single syllable meaning the underground roots that feed a tree from beneath the soil. The name was chosen deliberately because the hidden leaf takes its identity from the leaf, the visible part of the village, the part the world sees. But Danzo never saw himself as a leaf. He saw himself as the root system buried under the ground, the part no one notices, the part that keeps the whole tree alive, whether anyone thanks it or not. That single image tells you everything about how he understood his own role. And that philosophy shaped everything about how Root operated. The organization was built to be invisible, so its members had to be shaped into people who could disappear. Recruits were conditioned to erase their emotions entirely, because emotion, in Danzo's view, was a flaw, a variable that made an agent unpredictable. But conditioning alone wasn't enough for him. To guarantee that only the emotionally hollow remained, children in Root were forced to fight each other, sometimes to the death. The clearest example the series gives us is Sai, who was raised in Root alongside a boy he came to think of as his older brother, Shin. The two were ordered to fight one another until only one survived. Shin fell ill before that final fight could happen, but the intent was plain. Bonds were something to be severed, not built. Here's the part that reframes the whole picture, though. Officially, Root did not exist. The third Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi, ordered the division disbanded, judging its methods too brutal even for a shinobi village. But Danzo simply refused. He kept Root running in secret for decades, answering to no one, operating beneath the very leadership that believed it had shut him down. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because that one act of quiet disobedience is the foundation beneath nearly everything dark he later did. Every operation, every assassination, every manipulation traces back to a man who decided the village's official chain of command didn't apply to him. He wasn't a rogue outsider. He was sitting inside the system, smiling, while running a private army the Hokage thought was gone. Keeping something that large hidden for that long required a mechanism, and Root had one. Every operative carried a cursed seal placed on the tongue. Activated by a specific hand sign, the seal would paralyze the body and lock the jaw, making it physically impossible to speak Danzo's name or reveal anything about Root. The purpose was absolute silence. An agent captured and interrogated by an enemy could not betray the organization, because the moment they tried, the seal would seize control and stop the words before they formed. It's a chillingly practical solution. Danzo didn't rely on loyalty, which can waver. He relied on a jutsu that made betrayal a biological impossibility. Now, from a behind-the-scenes angle, there's something worth noting in how Masashi Kishimoto built this. Root and its members function almost entirely as a shadow reflection of the main cast. Sai was introduced during the Sasuke retrieval era, specifically as a foil to Naruto, a boy raised without a name, without emotion, without bonds, standing directly across from the boy whose entire strength comes from his connections to other people. Sai's very first arc is about him learning that the bonds Root tried to burn out of him are the thing worth protecting. So the whole design of Root exists partly to ask a single question. What would a person look like if you stripped away everything that made Naruto who he is? The answer is a Root operative. And that contrast runs deeper than the characters. The leaf and the root, the visible and the hidden, aren't just symbols in Danzo's head. They're the structural spine of his entire arc. Konoha presents itself to the world as a place of warmth, of teams, of the will of fire passed from one generation to the next. Danzo believed that warmth was a luxury paid for by someone willing to do the cold, ugly work in the dark. So he cast himself as that someone. In his own mind, he wasn't the villain undermining the village. He was the sacrifice keeping it standing, the root rotting quietly so the leaves above could stay green. Whether that belief was noble or simply the story a controlling man told himself is a question the series leaves deliberately open. What makes Root so unsettling isn't the violence. It's how reasonable it all sounds when Danzo explains it. Erase the emotion, seal the tongue, sever the bonds, disobey the Hokage, all of it justified as protection. And for a long time, it worked. The village never knew. But secrets that large tend to require other secrets to protect them. And Danzo's greatest one didn't involve Sai or Shin or a cursed seal at all. It involved a young Uchiha with the most feared eyes in the entire clan. A boy whose loyalty to the village was so complete that Danzo could not allow him to keep what made him extraordinary. His name was Shisui. The story of Shisui Uchiha begins with a number that almost no one in the Naruto world could match. Among all the Uchiha who ever awakened the Mangekyo Sharingan, Shisui held perhaps the single most dangerous ability the clan ever produced. Koto Amatsukami. It was a genjutsu so refined that it could enter a person's mind and rewrite their choices, planting decisions that felt entirely their own. The victim never struggled, never resisted, never even knew. To be controlled by Koto Amatsukami was to feel completely free while being completely owned. That distinction matters because most powerful techniques announce themselves. A fireball is seen, a chidori is heard. But Koto Amatsukami left no trace, and that silence is exactly what made Danzo Shimura unable to sleep. A man who had spent his entire life building leverage over others suddenly faced a boy who could take that leverage away without anyone noticing. So Danzo did not admire the power. He feared it. Shisui, though, had no interest in domination. He was known within the village by a title that tells you everything about his intentions. Shisui of the Body Flicker, a shinobi so fast his movements blurred, yet a peacemaker at heart. When tension inside the Uchiha clan began building toward a coup against Konoha, Shisui saw the coming bloodshed and formed a plan that required no killing at all. He would use Koto Amatsukami on the clan's leadership, gently steering them away from rebellion and back toward loyalty. One genjutsu, cast in secret, and thousands of lives spared. But here the record turns cruel, because Koto Amatsukami carries a cost that undermines the very idea of a quick solution. The technique can only be used roughly once every 10 years. A single decade of waiting between activations. For a plan meant to stop an imminent war, that limitation was staggering. One shot, and then a 10-year silence before the eye could be trusted again. Shisui knew he had exactly one chance to get it right. Danzo knew it too. So rather than let Shisui spend that one precious use on peace, Danzo ambushed him and tore out his right eye. In a single act, the most humane solution to the entire Uchiha crisis was destroyed. The boy who could have ended the conflict without a single death was left half blind, his plan collapsing around him. And this is the hinge on which the whole tragedy turns. Because with Shisui's peaceful path erased, the only remaining option became violence. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come. Danzo did not simply discard the stolen eye. He implanted Shisui's right Sharingan directly into his own right eye socket, carrying the Uchiha's power inside his body like a hidden weapon. But the 10-year restriction followed the eye. To bypass that brutal cooldown, Danzo relied on something even more disturbing. Cells from Hashirama Senju, the first Hokage, grafted into his own arm. Those cells could accelerate the recovery of Koto Amatsukami, shrinking the weight so the genjutsu could be used again far sooner than nature allowed. So the man who feared mind control the most became the one person walking around able to use it repeatedly. Think about what that means as a record. Shisui, the rightful owner, could use Koto Amatsukami once a decade. Danzo, the thief, engineered a way to fire it multiple times by fusing 2 of the most sacred bloodlines in the entire world inside his own body. The victim was limited. The criminal was not. That inversion is one of the darkest arithmetic problems in the whole story. For Shisui, the loss of his eye was not the end of his usefulness. It was the beginning of his final choice. Cornered, betrayed, and aware that Danzo or others would soon come for his remaining left eye, Shisui made a decision that would echo through everything afterward. He gave his last Sharingan to his closest friend, Itachi Uchiha, entrusting him with both the eye and the burden of protecting the village. And then, rather than let his power fall into the wrong hands, he went to the Naka River, the very river tied to the Uchiha's secret meeting place, and leaped to his death. His final words were not about revenge or anger. They were about the village, about protecting Konoha even at the cost of his own life. Those words became a quiet counterweight to Danzo's cold methods, because the 2 men wanted the same outcome, a stable village, but arrived through opposite doors. One was willing to steal an eye and sacrifice a clan. The other was willing to sacrifice only himself. And so the eye that Danzo feared ended up split between 2 people, half sealed inside the man who craved control, and half resting in the hands of the boy who would soon be asked to do the unthinkable. Shisui's death did not resolve the coming crisis. It merely handed the weight of it to someone else, someone whose loyalty would be tested more severely than any shinobi before him. That person had already lost his best friend to this darkness. His name was Itachi, and his part of the story was only just beginning. Behind the familiar appearance of Itachi Uchiha, the calm older brother, the gifted prodigy, the man history would remember as a traitor, lies a truth that turns everything you think you know completely upside down. Because Itachi was never the villain of his own story. He was its greatest victim, and the person who made him one was Danzo Shimura. Here is what most people get backwards. When you first learn of the Uchiha massacre, you assume Itachi chose it. You assume a boy woke up one night, decided his family was expendable, and slaughtered them in cold blood. But that is not what happened. It was Danzo, working alongside the village elders Homura Mitokato and Koharu Utatane, who handed Itachi the order. The Uchiha clan was planning a coup, a rebellion that would have split Konoha in 2 and dragged the entire village into civil war. To stop it before it began, they told the 13-year-old boy to eliminate his own clan, every man, woman, and shinobi who carried the Uchiha name. Think about the weight of that. Itachi did not want to do it. He loved his village, and he loved his family, and Danzo forced him to choose between the 2. So Itachi made the impossible choice. He accepted the mission, believing that one night of horror could spare thousands of lives in a war that had not yet come. But Danzo added a condition, and this is where the cruelty becomes almost unbearable. Itachi was allowed to spare exactly one person, his younger brother, Sasuke. Only one. And even that single act of mercy came with a price. To keep the truth buried, Itachi had to leave the village as a hated, missing nin, carrying the mark of a mass murderer for the rest of his life. He would be hunted, despised, and remembered as a monster, all so the secret would never surface. Danzo did not just take Itachi's family. He took his name, his honor, and his future, and asked him to smile while giving them up. And here is the contradiction that defines Danzo more sharply than any speech ever could. He ordered a child to murder his own parents in the name of peace. He justified it as protecting the village. Yet in doing so, he proved that he would sacrifice absolutely anyone, including children, the moment he judged them useful to Konoha's survival. The man who claimed to guard the leaf was willing to burn one of its oldest families to the ground and call it mercy. But here's what almost nobody knows. Itachi was not powerless in this bargain. He walked away from that night carrying leverage of his own, and he used it to build a wall around the one thing he still loved. Itachi warned Danzo directly. If anything ever happened to Sasuke, if the boy was harmed, hunted, or killed, then the full truth of the massacre, the order that came from within Konoha itself, would be leaked to the village's enemies. It would expose the elders, shatter the Leaf's reputation, and hand its rivals a weapon they could never counter. So Danzo, the man who feared no shinobi, was forced to hold back. For years he restrained himself, unable to touch Sasuke, unable to erase the last loose end, because a young rogue had checkmated him with a single threat. The most ruthless operator in the Hidden Leaf spent nearly a decade unable to act, kept in place by the very boy he had spared. And this is the tragedy that Danzo never understood. The logic he trusted, sacrifice a few to save the many, choose the cold calculation over the human cost, did not actually save the village. It planted a seed of destruction inside it. Because Sasuke grew up believing his brother had murdered their family out of ambition and madness. That belief filled him with a hatred so deep it consumed his entire life. He abandoned Konoha, allied with its enemies, and turned every ounce of that pain into a blade aimed straight back at the Leaf. The same order that was meant to prevent one civil war created the very hatred that would later threaten to finish what the Uchiha coup never started. Danzo tried to buy peace with a child's suffering, and the interest on that debt came due years later, more dangerous than the threat he thought he had erased. He did not eliminate the Uchiha problem. He simply delayed it and made it far, far worse. That is the counterintuitive heart of it. The massacre was not Itachi's crime. It was Danzo's decision, and Itachi carried the blame to protect a village that never knew what it owed him.
2 men, 1 order, and a chain of consequences that no amount of calculation could contain. But long before Danzo ever whispered a command in the shadows, long before the Uchiha rose or fell, there was one man whose power alone held the entire village together. A shinobi so strong that even the tailed beasts bent to his will. His name was Hashirama Senju. And to understand the darkness beneath the leaf, you first have to understand the man who planted it. If you look closely at Hashirama Senju, you notice something strange about his legacy. He was the man who founded the Hidden Leaf, the first Hokage, a shinobi whose wood release could shape forests out of nothing, and whose life force was so overwhelming that even the tailed beasts obeyed him. You would expect a power like that to die with the man. But it didn't. And the reason it didn't is one of the quietest, strangest accidents in the entire story of the Leaf. When Hashirama died, his body carried something no other shinobi possessed, a cellular life force so potent that it could regenerate, adapt, and grant abilities to almost anyone who received it. Most people would have let that gift rest with him. But Orochimaru, one of the Leaf's own legendary Sannin, saw an opportunity. So he began harvesting and experimenting with Hashirama's cells, splicing them into test subjects, trying to recreate that impossible vitality in a laboratory. Most of those experiments failed. The bodies rejected the cells, or the subjects simply died. Out of dozens of trials, only one child ever survived the process, a boy named Yamato, who inherited the wood release by accident. But here is where the story turns, because Orochimaru wasn't the only man who wanted that power. Danzo Shimura, the shadow of the leaf, understood exactly what those cells could do. So he obtained them too, and rather than pass them to a test subject, he grafted Hashirama's cells directly into his own right arm. It was a gamble that should have killed him. Instead, the cells took hold and turned his arm into something monstrous. Along that arm, embedded into the flesh, bristled 10 additional Sharingan eyes, a grotesque garden of eyes harvested from slaughtered members of the Uchiha clan. One stolen legacy fused to another, stitched into a single limb. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Because on their own, those Sharingan eyes were dangerous, and Hashirama's cells were valuable. But combined, they unlocked a technique so forbidden that most shinobi never even learned its name. It's called Izanagi. Setup. A normal Sharingan can copy jutsu and see through illusion. But when you pair a Sharingan with Hashirama's regenerative cells, something breaks the rules entirely. Izanagi lets its user blur the line between illusion and reality. And when a fatal blow lands, the wielder can rewrite that moment, turning the wound into a dream that never happened. In practical terms, Danzo could be stabbed through the heart and then simply decide that it didn't count. That sounds like immortality. But Izanagi has a price, and it is a brutal one. Each time it activates, one of those implanted Sharingan eyes closes forever, blinded permanently by the technique it just performed. So Danzo wasn't invincible. He was carrying a countdown. 10 Sharingan eyes meant 10 uses, 10 stolen lives embedded in a single arm, each one winking shut the moment it saved him. Every time he cheated death, he spent one. He fought like a man with reserves, timing his own apparent deaths, letting enemies believe they'd won, only to reopen his eyes on a body that was, in his mind, never really harmed. And you could actually count his remaining lives by counting the eyes still open on his arm. This is the detail that makes Danzo such a strange figure. He wasn't born powerful. Hashirama's genius, the Uchiha's eyes, Izanagi's forbidden trick, none of it belonged to him. He assembled himself out of the corpses and legacies of other people, and then justified every piece of it as protection for the village. A man literally built from the dead, walking around as a monument to his own philosophy, that the Leaf's survival was worth any theft, any experiment, any life quietly ended in the dark. And the accident at the center of it all is worth sitting with. Hashirama's cells were never meant to become a weapon in Danzo's arm. They were meant to build a village, forests, homes, the very foundations of Konoha. But because Orochimaru chose to experiment instead of mourn, and because Danzo chose to steal instead of let go, the first Hokage's greatest gift became the engine of the village's darkest man. The same life force that once bent tailed beasts to peace ended up powering a technique designed to cheat death and hide murder. a happy accident of biology, twisted step by step into something its owner would have despised.
It's a quiet irony, and it says something about the leaf itself. The village Hashirama dreamed of as a place where children wouldn't have to die in war became a village whose shadow council kept itself alive by harvesting the dead. His cells outlived him, but they didn't carry his ideals. They carried whatever the next hand chose to do with them. And of all the people shaped by that cycle of stolen eyes and buried secrets, one boy would grow up carrying more of it than anyone realized. A child of the very clan those Sharingan were taken from. His name was Sasuke Uchiha, and his story begins where Danzo's darkness was quietly pointing all along. People rarely talk about Sasuke Uchiha as the person who finally closed the book on Danzo Shimura, but that's exactly what happened, and the connection runs deeper than a single duel. By the time of the Fourth Great Ninja War arc, Danzo had climbed higher than he ever had before. During the 5 Kage Summit, he was named the candidate for 6th Hokage, the title he'd wanted his entire life, the seat he believed he'd earned through every secret sacrifice. So he stood there, at the summit of his ambition, representing the hidden leaf among the strongest leaders in the ninja world. But the moment he stepped into that role, the very clan he had exploited was about to catch up with him. Sasuke found him, and their battle became one of the clearest windows into how Danzo's stolen power actually worked. Because here's the setup. Danzo carried 10 Sharingan eyes implanted along his right arm, harvested from the Uchiha, and each of those eyes fueled a forbidden technique called Izanagi. Izanagi lets the user rewrite reality for a brief window, turning a fatal wound into an illusion, undoing death itself, but at a cost. Every time Danzo used it, one of those Sharingan eyes closed forever. So Sasuke's problem wasn't landing a hit, it was landing enough of them. He had to strike Danzo again and again, watching each eye shut one by one, 10 times over, before a single attack could finally stick. The mechanics of Izanagi had never been shown so completely, and it took an Uchiha to drag it fully into the light. And that's where the connection turns almost poetic. Danzo's most powerful jutsu was built entirely on Uchiha eyes. Power he took, not power he was born with. So it carries a strange weight that the one person capable of unraveling it was Sasuke, a child of the very clan those eyes came from. Everything Danzo stole was undone by the bloodline he stole it from. His death wasn't just a defeat, it was the collapse of a system that only ever borrowed its strength. But what's really surprising comes next, because Danzo's character stayed consistent right to the final second. As Sasuke closed in, Danzo grabbed Karin, a member of Sasuke's own team, someone he'd taken hostage, and pulled her in front of him as a human shield. Then he told Sasuke to strike straight through her. Think about that setup. Here was a man moments from death, and his instinct was the same instinct that had defined his whole life. No ally's survival, no innocent's life, ever outweighed his own. He'd built an entire career on that math, sacrificing others quietly for what he called the good of the village. So it fit that his last gamble was to spend one more life to save himself. This is the moment fans still argue about. Was Danzo a necessary evil who protected the leaf from the shadows, or just a man who dressed his own survival up as duty? Tell me in the comments which side you land on. I read all of them. Sasuke, for his part, was willing to strike through Karin to reach him, which tells you how far gone he was by this point too. But that's a thread for another time. What matters is that the shield failed, and Danzo ran out of eyes. So he reached for one final option. Defeated and cornered, he summoned Baku, a tapir-like creature capable of a devastating vacuum technique that inhales and crushes everything in front of it. Danzo used that vacuum jutsu in a last attempt to drag Sasuke into death alongside him. The same logic as the human shield, just scaled up. If he was going down, he'd take his enemy with him. But even that wasn't his final act. As the life drained out of him, Danzo activated a sealing technique on his own body, the reverse 4 symbols formation. It's a jutsu that, upon the user's death, pulls everything nearby into a sealed void, erasing evidence and taking secrets to the grave. So the man who had spent decades operating in shadow, hoarding forbidden knowledge, chose to die exactly as he had lived, secretively and destructively, sealing away the truth even in his final breath. Tobi, the masked figure watching from a distance, had to pull Sasuke clear before the seal finished, or Sasuke would have vanished with him. Danzo's whole existence, from the Uchiha eyes on his arm to the void he left behind, was about controlling what others were allowed to see. And that's the quiet thread worth holding on to, because the masked man who saved Sasuke in that moment, the one lurking at the edge of Danzo's death, he had his own history with the Uchiha clan, his own stolen face, his own reasons for wanting Danzo gone. He wore the name Tobi, but that wasn't who he really was. Behind that spiral mask was someone the village had already buried once, someone whose story would rewrite everything you thought you understood about loyalty in the hidden leaf. His real name was Obito Uchiha. Curiously enough, Obito Uchiha spent years hiding behind that mask precisely because the world believed he was dead, killed during the Third Great Ninja War at Kanabi Bridge. His teammate Kakashi carried his memory, his gifted Sharingan, and his final words about protecting comrades. But the boy who died that day never truly died, and the man he became would reach directly into Danzo Shimura's downfall. Because when Danzo finally met his end, it wasn't purely Sasuke's revenge that killed him. It was orchestration. Obito, wearing the identity of Madara Uchiha, had been guiding Sasuke's path for a long time, feeding him truths and half-truths about the Uchiha massacre. So, when Sasuke learned that Danzo had ordered Itachi to slaughter their entire clan, the target was set. Obito simply made sure Sasuke found him. Danzo, the man who had spent his entire life controlling threats from the shadows, was maneuvered into position by someone hiding in shadows far deeper than his own. That is the contradiction at the center of his character. His whole method depended on seeing every danger before it arrived, on knowing the board better than any opponent. Yet he was played like a piece on that board, used as a pawn to push Sasuke one step further into darkness. Their fight on the summit island was fierce. Danzo revealed the secret beneath his bandages and his right arm. 10 Sharingan eyes harvested from dead Uchiha, along with the transplanted cells of Hashirama Senju that let him cheat death through his Izanagi technique. But even with those stolen eyes, even with the power to rewrite reality for brief moments, he lost. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the eyes he wore were the very proof of everything he had done in secret. The man who claimed to protect Konoha from the Uchiha died wearing the Uchiha's own eyes, undone by the last surviving Uchiha he had helped create. Danzo's death, though, did not end his reach. His legacy lived on through the people he shaped. The clearest example is Sai, a young operative raised inside Root, Danzo's Black Ops division, stripped of a name and trained to erase his own emotions. Sai was originally assigned to Team Kakashi with a hidden order, to gather information on Sasuke and, if necessary, to eliminate him. So, even after Danzo was gone, his hand was still moving, still guiding agents toward outcomes he had planned. That is what makes his influence so unsettling. He didn't need to be alive to keep acting on the village. He had built a machine of loyal, nameless tools,
and that machine kept running. But Sai's story also became the crack in Danzo's design. Through his bond with Naruto and the members of Team 7, Sai slowly recovered the emotions Root had tried to bury. He remembered his brother. He learned to smile without faking it. So the very person meant to embody Danzo's cold philosophy ended up rejecting it, proving that the darkness Danzo cultivated could still be undone by connection. Danzo believed people were instruments. Sai's growth quietly argued the opposite. This is the deeper reason Masashi Kishimoto wrote Danzo the way he did. Danzo isn't a cackling villain who wants to destroy the world. He genuinely loved Konoha. Every terrible thing he did, the assassinations, the coerced suicides sealed onto Root members' tongues, the manipulation of Itachi, he justified as necessary for peace. And through him, Kishimoto asks a hard question that the story deliberately refuses to answer cleanly. Can a village justify evil in the name of protecting itself? Naruto never gives you a comfortable resolution. Itachi murdered his own family to prevent a civil war, and the story treats that as both a tragedy and a genuine sacrifice. Danzo did much of the same, yet he is remembered very differently. So why? The difference is where the love pointed. Itachi's choices cost him everything and asked nothing in return. Danzo's choices always seemed to leave him holding more power. He wanted to be Hokage. He briefly became the 6th Hokage candidate after Pain's assault on the village, appointed by the daimyo. But he never truly held the seat, and history did not record him as a leader who protected the leaf. It remembered him as the darkness beneath it. A patriot whose love for Konoha curdled, slowly, into the very corruption he insisted he was guarding against. He became the threat he had spent his life hunting. And that is the strange, quiet tragedy of Danzo Shimura. He was so afraid of the shadows swallowing his village that he stepped into them himself and never noticed the moment he stopped being the guardian and became the thing that needed guarding against. His story only makes sense when you set it beside the man who stood in the light, the leader who trusted where Danzo controlled, who forgave where Danzo eliminated. They were childhood rivals, shaped by the same war, and they chose opposite paths. To understand what Danzo truly was, you have to look at the friend he spent a lifetime standing behind. His name was Hiruzen Sarutobi. Originally, Hiruzen Sarutobi wasn't destined to stand alone at the top. He was one of several children pulled into the same classroom, trained side by side beneath 2 founding legends. The first Hokage, Hashirama Senju, oversaw their earliest years, but it was the second Hokage, Tobirama Senju, who personally took charge of their instruction. Several students learned under him directly, among them Hiruzen, Danzo Shimura, Homura Mitokado, and Koharu Utatane. They weren't strangers who met later in life. They grew up in the same war, memorized the same lessons, and answered to the same teacher. And here is where a quiet mistake in interpretation began to matter. Tobirama taught a hard, pragmatic philosophy, that the village comes first, that survival sometimes demands cruelty, that a shinobi must be willing to sacrifice for the whole. Hiruzen heard those words. Danzo absorbed them. The same lecture landed in 2 very different minds, and the difference would shape Konoha for the next 50 years. Tobirama meant those teachings as a warning about the cost of leadership. Danzo took them as permission. Decades later, when Danzo justified Root's darkest operations, he wasn't inventing a new doctrine. He was quoting his old teacher, twisting a caution into a command. So think of it as a glitch in transmission. One idea entered the classroom, and it forked. Hiruzen carried the mercy Tobirama also believed in. Danzo carried only the ruthlessness, and he convinced himself he was the more faithful student. That fork is the origin point of everything that comes later. The two boys were rivals long before they were old men. When the time came to name the third Hokage, Hiruzen and Danzo were both candidates. Both had trained under the second. Both believed they understood what the village needed. But Tobirama chose Hiruzen, not Danzo. And Danzo never publicly accepted that decision. Not for a year, not for a decade, not ever. He carried the loss quietly, and he spent the rest of his life believing the wrong man had been chosen. He didn't rebel. He didn't challenge it openly. He simply stayed convinced, in private, that he was the more suitable leader. That silent refusal is the seed of root itself. Because Danzo couldn't take the title, he built a shadow version of the office he was denied. An organization that answered to him alone, operating beneath the Hokage he was supposed to serve. Now, yet the most unexpected part is still to come. You might assume the rivalry made them enemies. It didn't. Danzo spent his entire career standing behind Hiruzen, supporting his rule from the darkness even as he undermined it. That contradiction is deliberate, and it's baked into the character's design. Masashi Kishimoto built Danzo as Hiruzen's shadow. The two of them are a matched pair, the same generation split into light and dark. Hiruzen earned the titles the Professor and the God of Shinobi, names that celebrate openness. He was famous for knowing every jutsu in the village, for teaching freely, for governing in the light. Danzo was the inverse. Everything he did happened in secret. No public credit, no visible authority, no acknowledgement. Where Hiruzen was the face of Konoha, Danzo was the thing operating underneath it. One character can't exist, thematically, without the other. Remove Hiruzen's idealism, and Danzo has nothing to react against. And that reaction is the whole point. Because Hiruzen chose leniency, because he ruled with idealism and mercy, Danzo drew a conclusion. That someone had to be willing to get his hands dirty. In his mind, Hiruzen's kindness was a weakness that left the village exposed, and it fell to him to cover the gaps. Every conspiracy Danzo runs beneath Konoha traces back to this single judgment. The Uchiha, the manipulation, the assassinations, the secret deals. None of it starts with ambition for its own sake. It starts with a man who believed his friend was too soft to protect what they'd both sworn to defend. So the irony sharpens. Hiruzen's greatest virtue, his compassion, is precisely what convinced Danzo that darkness was necessary. The kinder Hiruzen ruled, the more Danzo felt justified operating in the shadows. They were two halves of one argument about how to keep a village alive, and neither could win, because each one's existence proved the other's point. Hiruzen needed Danzo to do the ugly work he wouldn't. Danzo needed Hiruzen's leniency to justify doing it. They were teammates as children, rivals as young men, and for the rest of their lives they were bound together, one in the light, one in the dark, each certain he understood the lesson their teacher had taught them best. Tobirama's philosophy shaped them both, but it broke them apart. That's the tragedy underneath the hidden leaf. Not two enemies at war, but two friends who agreed on the goal and disagreed on everything else about how to reach it. Which raises a quiet question. If Danzo believed so completely that he needed to build his own hidden weapon, his own shinobi raised entirely in the dark, loyal only to him, then who was the first child he ever tried to shape into that image? There was a boy, and his name was Kinoe. One often overlooked detail about Kinoe is that he wasn't just a character invented to fill out a filler arc. He was the answer to a question the series had been quietly asking for years. What would happen if someone actually succeeded in copying the first Hokage's power? Orochimaru had tried. He took cells from Hashirama Senju and injected them into 60 different children, hoping even one of them would awaken wood release, the Kekkei Genkai that let Hashirama grow forests from bare ground and, more importantly, subdue the tailed beasts. 59 of those children died. Only one survived. That survivor was Kinoe. Now, that alone would make him rare. But here's where the hidden thread gets interesting. Orochimaru ran the experiment, but Orochimaru wasn't the only one watching the results. Danzo Shimura was. And when the smoke cleared and only one boy remained breathing, it was Danzo who quietly took him. So the very same cells that obsessed Orochimaru became the foundation of Danzo's private ambition. Two of Konoha's most infamous men, both circling the same child for the same reason. Because Hashirama's power could control the nine-tailed beasts, and whoever controlled those controlled the balance of the entire shinobi world. This is where the Easter egg lives, because Kinoe's whole story unfolds in a corner of the anime most casual viewers skip entirely. His arc runs through the Kakashi Anbu Chronicles, sometimes grouped with the Kakashi Gaiden material, across episodes 349 to 361. And in those episodes, the boy hunting Kinoe is a young, masked Kakashi Hatake, still in Anbu, still carrying the weight of losing Obito and Rin. So the show quietly stitched together two future teammates, Yamato and Kakashi, years before Team 7 ever existed in the main story. Most fans meet Yamato as a calm, dependable captain. Almost nobody realizes his first real appearance is as a boy running for his life from the very man who would later become his lifelong comrade. But here's what almost nobody knows. The name Kinoe itself is a small, buried reference. It's one of the 10 heavenly stems from the old Chinese sexagenary calendar. And in Japanese, it's associated with wood. Kinoe literally carries the elder wood reading. So Danzo, or Orochimaru before him, gave this child a codename that spelled out his purpose. The boy wasn't named for who he was. He was named for what he was grown to be, a vessel for wood release. And when Danzo later renamed him Tenzo, and later still when Tsunade gave him the name Yamato, each name was another layer painted over that original label. His identity was rewritten so many times that the gentleman we know in the main series is standing on top of 3 or 4 buried versions of himself. Because that's the part that catches people off guard. Yamato, the patient, loyal leaf shinobi who holds Naruto's chakra in check during his tailed beast training. The one who cracks nervous jokes and gives that wide-eyed, scary face, began his life as Danzo's secret weapon. He was a walking piece of Danzo's plan to replicate the first Hokage. Danzo didn't want a soldier. He wanted a shortcut to Hashirama's power, and Kinoe was that shortcut made flesh. So every kind thing Yamato does in the later series is, in a quiet way, a rejection of the purpose he was created for. And this connects to the larger obsession that defined Danzo's entire life. He didn't stop at Kinoe. Decades later, that same fixation on Hashirama's cells is exactly what leads Danzo to graft the first Hokage's cells into his own right arm, and to carry a piece of Hashirama's face beneath the bandages he always wore. So the boy Kinoe wasn't a one-time experiment. He was the first visible symptom of a hunger that never left Danzo. The belief that if he couldn't be Hashirama, he could at least own fragments of him. One child, one arm, one stolen face at a time. There's a small irony in it too. Danzo spent his life trying to manufacture loyalty in the dark, to raise weapons that answered only to him. But Kinoe, the one success, is the one who slipped away. In those Anbu Chronicles episodes, Kinoe slowly begins to question his orders.
And it's partly through Kakashi's example that he starts to imagine a life outside Danzo's shadow. So the experiment worked in the exact opposite direction Danzo intended. He created a survivor strong enough to eventually walk out of the darkness he was born into, which leaves us with the other figure standing in that story, the masked boy sent to hunt him. Because while Kinoe was being shaped in secret, Kakashi Hatake was being shaped too, only out in the open, under a different kind of pressure. He had already lost the people closest to him, and he was learning what it cost to follow orders without question. And to understand how the leaf's darkness truly worked, you have to understand the boy behind that Ambu mask, and what he was willing to carry. Here's something genuinely fascinating about Kakashi Hatake. Long before he ever wore the Hokage's hat, Danzo Shimura looked at him and saw a weapon. Think about the timing. Kakashi had already lost his father, Sakumo, to suicide. Then came Obito, crushed beneath a boulder in the Third Shinobi War, giving Kakashi his Sharingan with a dying wish. And then Rin, dying on Kakashi's own hand, impaled by his Chidori after she threw herself into the attack. By the time Kakashi joined the Anbu, he was maybe 14, hollowed out by grief, and quietly brilliant with a blade. To Danzo, that combination was perfect. A boy with nothing left to lose was exactly the kind of clay he preferred to shape. So Danzo tried to recruit him into Root, the buried, off-the-books branch of the Anbu that Danzo ran like a private army. And here's where the story becomes something like a scrapped, alternate version of Kakashi that almost existed. Picture it. There's a timeline, sketched right into the edges of Kishimoto's writing, where Kakashi Hatake becomes a Root operative, emotionless, nameless, a tool who kills on command and never asks why. Danzo genuinely believed he could complete that boy into exactly that. The talent was there. The grief was there. Everything Danzo needed was already in place. But Kakashi refused. Not with a dramatic speech, not with defiance, just a quiet, stubborn unwillingness to fully belong to anyone. And that quiet rejection matters more than it looks. Danzo spent decades collecting the strongest shinobi the leaf produced, folding them into Root, erasing their names. Kakashi is one of the very few who slipped that grasp and kept his own conscience intact. He stayed in the regular Anbu, under the third Hokage's chain of command, rather than disappearing into Danzo's shadow organization. Therefore, that scrapped version of Kakashi, the perfect Root killer, never got made. Now, the Kakashi Anbu Chronicles arc, which runs through episodes 349 to 361 of Naruto Shippuden, shows you how hard Danzo pushed on that idea anyway. Even after the refusal, Danzo doesn't simply let go. He works the angles. He manipulates mission assignments, applies pressure, tests where Kakashi's limits are, always probing to see whether grief can be twisted into obedience. You watch Danzo cultivate loyal killers out of young, mourning operatives, and you realize the recruitment pitch was never really a single conversation. It was a slow, patient campaign, and Kakashi was one of its central targets. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Danzo's method wasn't cruelty for its own sake. He believed sincerely that the village needed people willing to do the unforgivable in the dark, so that others could sleep in the light. That's the logic that produced Root. So when he looked at Kakashi, he wasn't seeing a child to ruin. He was seeing a resource he was certain the leaf couldn't afford to waste on sentiment. That's what makes the failure sting for him. He wasn't wrong about the talent. Kakashi went on to master over 1,000 jutsu with his Sharingan, earning the name Copy Ninja, exactly the kind of versatility Danzo prized. Danzo just couldn't own the part that mattered.
Here's the contrast Kishimoto builds on purpose, and it's almost the opposite of what you'd expect from a boy that broken. The grieving Anbu that Danzo wanted to mold into a silent killer became the sixth Hokage. Not a weapon, a teacher. The man who trained Team 7, who taught Naruto and Sasuke and Sakura that those who abandon their friends are worse than trash. That single line is the exact inversion of Root's philosophy, where comrades are interchangeable and emotion is a liability. Danzo wanted a shinobi who felt nothing. What Kakashi became was a shinobi defined almost entirely by what he refused to stop feeling. For Obito, for Rin, for every student he later swore to protect. So Danzo's failure with Kakashi isn't a small footnote. It foreshadows his entire pattern. He could command power. He could assemble it, hide it, aim it. Root was full of capable operatives, and Danzo held real authority as an elder advisor to the Hokage. But he could never truly own the hearts of the strongest shinobi. Itachi worked for him and despised him. Kakashi slipped away young.
And that gap between commanding power and possessing loyalty is the exact weakness that eventually isolates Danzo completely, until he's a man surrounded by borrowed strength and no genuine allegiance at all. The Kakashi he wanted was a version that history simply refused to print. It's a strange kind of victory, the quiet kind. No battle, no confrontation, just a boy who declined to become the darkest possible version of himself, and in doing so, denied Danzo one of the tools he wanted most. Kakashi carried his grief instead of surrendering it, and it made him gentler, not colder. But Kakashi wasn't the only child the war left hollowed out and staring into the dark. Somewhere far from the leaf, another orphan was learning a very different lesson from his pain, one that would teach him to see the whole shinobi world as something broken enough to need remaking.
There's something most people don't know about Nagato. His story and Danzo's story quietly cross paths at the single darkest moment in the Leaf's history, and almost no one notices the connection. To understand it, you have to go back to who Nagato was before he became pain. He was born in Amegakure, the village hidden in the rain, a small nation crushed between larger powers and endlessly used as a battlefield. He was a war orphan, and he carried the Rinnegan, the same legendary eyes tied to the Sage of the Six Paths. But those eyes weren't really his by birth. They were transplanted into him by Madara Uchiha, who was operating in the shadows, grooming a weapon he could one day use for the Eye of the Moon plan. So the very power that made Nagato a god in the eyes of the world was, from the start, a gift with a hidden price. That's the setup, because when Nagato finally turned his grief into a philosophy, the belief that only shared pain could force the world toward peace, he pointed that philosophy directly at Konoha. And that's where Danzo Shimura steps quietly into the frame. During the events surrounding the invasion of Konoha, Danzo did something almost no one in the village would have believed. He gave orders to the Anbu under his control, his root operatives, not to interfere. Think about what that means. The most powerful enemy in a generation was preparing to descend on the Leaf, and one of its own leaders chose to hold his forces back. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. He wanted the attack to happen. Why? Because the Akatsuki assault would fall hardest on the loyalists who followed Tsunade, the people whose vision of the village stood in Danzo's way. If the attack weakened them, it cleared a path. Danzo was willing to let Konoha itself be wounded if that wound advanced his own claim to the Hokage seat. This is one of his most damning betrayals, because it wasn't a mistake or a misjudgment. It was a choice to stand aside while the very shinobi laying waste to his home did their work. And here's the part that makes it worse. It nearly worked. But what's really surprising comes next. When Pain's assault left the village in ruins and Tsunade had fallen into a coma, the resulting chaos didn't punish Danzo. It rewarded him. The Fire Daimyo, the feudal lord overseeing the Land of Fire, named Danzo as the candidate for 6th Hokage. The invasion he quietly allowed to unfold had, for a moment, handed him almost everything he had ever wanted. The seat, the authority, the recognition he'd chased his entire life from the shadows. So follow the logic of it. Nagato attacks the Leaf. Danzo holds back his forces. The Leaf's strongest voices for a gentler path are killed or scattered. And out of that wreckage, Danzo rises. It's a clean, cold chain of cause and effect, and it tells you everything about how he saw the world. To him, the ends justified any means, even standing aside while an enemy burned his own village, because the ashes might be arranged into a throne. But now here's the dark irony that ties these two men together, and it's the kind of detail that stays with you. Nagato, the invader, the man who killed so many in Konoha, did something Danzo never would have. After his confrontation with Naruto, moved by the boy's refusal to answer hatred with hatred, Nagato used the samsara of heavenly life technique. He gave his own life to revive everyone he had killed during the assault. The enemy who caused the destruction personally undid it. He chose, at the very end, to believe in something better than pain. Danzo did the opposite. During that same event, while Nagato was moving toward redemption, Danzo was scheming to profit from the death around him. One man tried to erase the harm he'd done. The other tried to harvest it. And when the truth of Danzo's actions is measured, it leaves a permanent stain on his record, a mark that no clever justification can wash away. That contrast is the whole point. Nagato and Danzo both grew out of the same shinobi world, both shaped by war, both convinced they understood what peace required. But Nagato, for all his monstrous acts, could still be reached, could still lay down his life for a stranger's ideal. Danzo could not be reached, because he had already decided that the village existed to serve his vision of it, not the other way around. Even standing aside while the shinobi destroying the Leaf did their work was, to him, simply a tool. Just another means to an end. And that's what makes Danzo's story so unsettling. He didn't need an outside enemy to threaten Konoha. He was willing to let one in through the front door if it served him. But he never worked entirely alone. To carry out orders like these, to hold back the Anbu, to keep his secrets buried, he needed operatives loyal enough to obey without question. And one of the quietest of them all carried a hidden weapon inside his own body, waiting for the moment Danzo would ask him to use it. What very few people realize is that Torune Aburame was never meant to be a background face in Danzo's shadow army. He was one of 2 personal bodyguards Danzo kept at his side, hand-selected from the ranks of Root, and his presence tells you almost everything about how Danzo built his organization from the inside out. Torune belonged to the Aburame clan, the insect users of the Hidden Leaf, the same clan that produced Shino. But where most Aburame partner with ordinary Kikaichu beetles that drain chakra, Torune carried something far rarer. From the age of 6, his body hosted a colony of venom beetles called the Rinkaichu, nano-sized insects that poison anything they touch. His skin itself became a weapon. A single tap could break down an enemy's cells from the inside, which is exactly why Danzo wanted him close. But a bodyguard who can kill with a touch is only half of the equation. The other half was a man named Fu Yamanaka, and Fu's ability was quieter, but arguably more valuable to a man obsessed with secrecy. Fu came from the Yamanaka clan, the mind specialists, and he possessed a technique that let him transfer his own consciousness directly into another person's body. Think about what that means for someone like Danzo. If Danzo's own body were ever captured, killed, or interrogated, Fu could carry his master's secrets out inside a borrowed vessel. Danzo didn't just plan for victory, he engineered a contingency for his own death, and Fu Yamanaka was that living insurance policy. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because loyalty like this doesn't happen by accident, and Danzo knew it. He didn't trust ordinary devotion. Instead, every full member of Root carried a cursed seal branded onto their tongue. The moment one of them tried to speak about Danzo, about Root, or about any of its operations, the seal activated and paralyzed them completely. They physically could not betray him. They could not confess under torture, could not leak a plan, could not even whisper the organization's name to an enemy. So when you look at Torune and Fu standing silently behind Danzo, understand that their silence wasn't only discipline. It was a sealing jutsu carved into their bodies, turning secrecy into a biological cage. That detail reframes everything about how Danzo operated. Most leaders in the Naruto world command loyalty through respect, fear, or shared belief. Danzo did something colder. He manufactured loyalty at the level of the body itself. Torune's venom beetles were implanted in childhood. Fu's mind technique made him a walking backup drive. The tongue seal made betrayal not just dangerous, but impossible. Danzo didn't recruit followers so much as he assembled tools, and he shaped each one to close off every exit before it could ever open. It's a chilling design, and it's consistent with everything the series eventually reveals about the man beneath the bandages. But here's the turn that undercuts all of that careful engineering. For all the planning, for all the seals and safeguards, Danzo's two perfect bodyguards died in a single confrontation, and they died fast. When Danzo traveled to the Kage summit, gathered in the Land of Iron to decide the fate of the Akatsuki and the ongoing war, he brought Torune and Fu with him. On the way, Sasuke Uchiha intercepted them. Sasuke was hunting Danzo specifically, driven by his need for revenge over the destruction of the Uchiha clan, a massacre Danzo had helped orchestrate. Torune and Fu stepped forward to protect their master, exactly as they were built to do, and they failed. Torune tried to use his Rinkaichu venom, cornering Sasuke and even landing contact. But Sasuke's Susanoo and his own resilience turned the fight against him. Fu attempted his mind transfer technique to hijack Sasuke's body, only for Sasuke's will and his Sharingan to overpower the intrusion. Both men fell before Danzo ever reached the summit chamber. So the great irony sits right there in plain sight. Danzo spent decades binding his agents so tightly that betrayal was physically impossible. But he never engineered a defense against a single Uchiha with a grudge. The seals held, the loyalty held, the bodies did not. Their deaths matter for more than tragedy. Stripping away Torune and Fu is what leaves Danzo exposed for his final showdown with Sasuke. The confrontation where his true collection of secrets, the transplanted Sharingan lining his arm, and the stolen cells of Hashirama, finally comes to light. The bodyguards were the last layer of protection, and once they were gone, everything Danzo had hidden began to unravel in real time. In a sense, Torune and Fu were the physical embodiment of his method, and their fall was the first crack in the wall he'd spent a lifetime building. Which brings us to another figure who lived in the space between loyalty and secrets, though he served a very different master. Because not everyone bound to the Hidden Leaf's shadows was a weapon. Some were watchers, gifted with an eye that could see what others couldn't, and one of them would spend years quietly guarding truths of his own. The story of Ao begins not in the Hidden Leaf, but far to the east, in the mist-covered village of Kirigakure, where he served as a shinobi loyal to the 5th Mizukage, Mei Terumi. He was not a legendary figure. He carried no famous title, no feared reputation across the nations. But behind the cloth wrapped over the right side of his face, Ao held something that made him one of the most quietly dangerous men in that room. and implanted Byakugan, the all-seeing eye of the Hyuga clan, taken years earlier from a defeated Hyuga of the Leaf. That single eye is the reason his name survives in the record at all. Because when the 5 Kage summit was called in the Land of Iron, gathering the leaders of the great villages to discuss the threat of the Akatsuki and the missing Uchiha, Ao stood behind his Mizukage as a bodyguard. He was there to watch. And with the Byakugan, watching meant something no ordinary guard could match. The Hyuga eye can perceive chakra itself, tracing its flow through the body, seeing the invisible threads that bind one technique to another. So while the Kage argued, Ao was reading the room in a way none of them could. And what he saw did not belong there. Danzo Shimura, the acting 6th Hokage candidate, was sitting calmly among them. But nearby, Ao detected the faint signature of a genjutsu at work, a subtle illusion woven not to attack, but to guide. Danzo had quietly cast it upon Mifune, the samurai general moderating the summit, nudging him to name Danzo the leader of a shinobi alliance without a single one of them noticing. Ao called it out. In front of the assembled leaders of the shinobi world, he accused Danzo of manipulating the summit through hidden genjutsu. It was a startling moment, because Ao had no authority there. He was a bodyguard from a small village, pointing at a man about to become Hokage. But the Byakugan does not lie, and his word planted the first crack in Danzo's carefully built image. Now here is where the record turned strange, because the illusion was only the surface. Danzo's real secret was written into his own body. Beneath the bandages that covered his right arm, 10 Sharingan eyes had been implanted into his flesh, 10 in a row, each one harvested from a slain member of the Uchiha clan. These were not trophies. They were fuel for a forbidden technique called Izanagi, and every eye he burned through was one more life he had taken from Konoha's own people. And yet the most unexpected part is still to come. A Sharingan cannot simply be grafted onto a stranger's body and survive. The Uchiha eye rejects an outside host, wearing down, going blind. So to keep 10 stolen eyes alive inside his arm, Danzo had done something no ordinary man could. He had his arm grafted with the cells of Hashirama Senju, the first Hokage, the god of shinobi himself. Hashirama's cells carried a regenerative power so strong they could stabilize the transplanted Sharingan and even feed the sprawling mokuton, the wood style, that grew across Danzo's arm. Think about what that means for a single body. Danzo Shimura, a man of no bloodline gift, had assembled inside himself the 2 forces that defined the founding of the Leaf: the Uchiha's Sharingan and the Senju's cells, blending the exact powers that the village's founders once fought and died over. One arm held the legacy of both rival clans at once, taken by force rather than born. This is the contradiction Ao's discovery exposed, even if Ao himself only glimpsed the edge of it. Danzo had spent his entire life claiming to be the true protector of Konoha, the man willing to do the ugly work to keep the village at peace. Yet he walked into a summit of the 5 nations carrying the stolen eyes of Konoha's own massacred clan sewn into his body. The man who said he defended the Leaf's future was built, quite literally, from the Leaf's murdered past. And that is why Ao matters to the record far more than his rank suggests. His single accusation about the genjutsu was the first public thread pulled loose. It cast doubt on Danzo in front of the people whose respect he needed most, weakening his claim to the title of Hokage at the very moment he was reaching for it. A minor bodyguard with a borrowed eye became the first outsider to name Danzo a liar to his face, and history proved him right. So the summit that was meant to crown Danzo instead began his unraveling. The illusions were seen through, the credibility was cracked, and the eyes, hidden beneath his bandages, were still waiting, still counting down. Each one a single use of a technique so forbidden that even among the Uchiha it was spoken of in warnings. Because that technique, the one those 10 stolen Sharingan were quietly powering all along, has a name. And to understand how a dying man could cheat death itself 10 separate times, we have to look closely at Izanagi. Behind the familiar appearance of Izanagi lies a technique that doesn't do what almost everyone assumes it does. On the surface, it looks like immortality. Danzo Shimura stands across from Sasuke Uchiha in the aftermath of the 5 Kage Summit arc, and no matter how many times Sasuke lands a killing blow, a blade through the chest, a strike to the heart, Danzo simply keeps breathing. Wounds that should end him close as if they were never there. But that's the illusion, and understanding why it's an illusion is where the real technique begins. Izanagi is a forbidden Uchiha jutsu, and its power is deceptively simple to describe. For a brief window of time, it lets the user blur the line between reality and illusion. Not on an enemy, the way most genjutsu works, but on themselves. When Danzo takes a fatal wound, Izanagi rewrites that moment, treating the injury as though it were only a dream. Reality bends. The wound becomes fiction, and Danzo returns to the state he was in before the strike landed. He cannot die, because for those seconds, death itself is downgraded to something that merely appeared to happen. So the natural conclusion is that Danzo is unkillable. But that conclusion is exactly backwards, and this is where the technique quietly turns against its own user. Izanagi has a price, and the price is written into the Sharingan itself. Each time the technique is used, the Sharingan that powered it goes dark, permanently. One eye, one escape from death, and then that eye closes forever, its light spent. This is why Danzo didn't rely on his own 2 eyes. It's why his right arm was lined with 10 transplanted Sharingan, harvested from members of the Uchiha clan he helped destroy. Every time Sasuke killed him, one more of those 10 eyes shut, spending itself to drag Danzo back from the grave. And here is the twist that flips the whole fight on its head. What looks like immortality is actually a countdown. Danzo isn't invincible. He's a man with a fixed number of second chances, and every use burns one away. The more he cheats death, the closer he moves toward the moment when he cannot cheat it again. Sasuke doesn't need to find some clever weakness or a hidden vulnerability. He simply has to keep going. He has to outlast the supply. Watching the eyes on Danzo's arm close one by one, Sasuke realizes he isn't fighting an immortal at all. He's watching a resource drain in real time, and all he has to do is spend it faster than Danzo can protect it. But here's what almost nobody knows. The name Izanagi wasn't invented for the fight at all. Masashi Kishimoto borrowed it directly from Japanese Shinto mythology. In the creation myth, Izanagi and Izanami are the divine pair who shape the world, the god who gives form and life, and the goddess bound to death and the underworld. Kishimoto tied these names into the lore of the Sage of the Six Paths, the mythical figure who founded Ninshu and, in a sense, the entire ninja world. So the technique that manipulates life and reality carries the name of the god of creation, while its sister technique, Izanami, which traps a target in an endless loop until they accept their fate, carries the name tied to death and inevitability. The jutsu that rewrites reality is named for the one who made the world. And that isn't decoration. It's the mythological logic baked into the design. So the countdown continues, and it moves in only one direction. Sasuke keeps pressing, keeps striking, and one by one, the Sharingan on Danzo's arm fall dark. 10 becomes fewer, and fewer becomes 1. And when that final eye closes, when the supply of stolen escapes is finally exhausted, Danzo is left as what he always was underneath the technique. An ordinary man who has run out of borrowed lives. Everything he took from the Uchiha, spent. Cornered, with Izanagi gone, Danzo reaches for one last piece of stolen power. On his forehead sits the eye of Shisui Uchiha, the source of Kotoa Matsukami, the most powerful mind control genjutsu in the series, able to bend a person's will without them ever knowing they've been controlled. Danzo unleashes its crow in a final, desperate move. But even this power isn't his. Shisui gave one eye willingly to Itachi. The other, Danzo took, driving Shisui toward his death by the Naka River. And so Danzo's entire final battle is built on other people's eyes and other people's sacrifices. The 10 Uchiha, whose Sharingan powered his survival, and Shisui, whose stolen eye fuels his last gambit. A life extended, again and again, on the strength of what belonged to the dead. When the fight ends, it ends the way it was always going to, with the supply gone and the debt finally called in. Danzo's power was never his own, and in the end, neither was his time. But the eyes weren't the only thing Danzo took from people who couldn't refuse. There was a member of the Yamanaka clan who followed him into that final moment, someone whose story is easy to overlook and worth staying awake just a little longer to hear. If you look closely at Fu Yamanaka, you find one of those small figures the story almost forgets. And yet the accident of who he was placed next to changed everything about how he's remembered. He first appears during the 5 Kage Summit arc, around chapter 458 of the manga, standing quietly at Danzo Shimura's side as one of his 2 personal bodyguards drawn from Root. And here's the first quiet surprise. When you hear the name Yamanaka, you probably think of Ino, of the intelligence division, of a warm clan that reads minds to help their village understand its enemies. But Fu didn't serve that side of the leaf. He served the darkness beneath it, the buried machinery Danzo built in the shadows. And that single placement reshapes how you read his entire clan technique. Because the Yamanaka arts are almost always shown as tools of connection. The mind-body switch technique is normally an interrogation method, a way to slip inside a captured enemy, or a piece of teamwork that lets an ally see through your eyes. It's cooperative by design. But Danzo looked at that same jutsu and saw something else entirely. He weaponized Fu's version of it as a bodyguard's escape hatch. If a fatal blow was coming, Fu could leap his consciousness out of his own dying body and into someone else's, and survive. So the very technique that the Yamanaka clan uses to build trust became, in Danzo's hands, a way to cheat death itself. That inversion is the whole reason Fu was chosen for the role. Now watch what happens when the plan actually breaks. Danzo needed to flee the summit after Sasuke Uchiha's ambush tore through the meeting, and it fell to Fu and his partner Torune to cover the retreat. This is where the lucky twist of his pairing becomes visible. Torune's body carried a poison, a nano-sized venom bred into his very skin, making his flesh dangerous to almost anyone who touched it. So when the moment came, Fu transferred his mind straight into Torune's poison-immune body. Think about what that means. Fu's mind, Torune's defenses. One weapon assembled from two men. Kishimoto didn't design these two as interchangeable guards standing in matching masks. He built them as a deliberately complementary pair, each one's weakness answered by the other's strength. And it's only in that desperate retreat that you get to see the design click into place. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Because the way Fu finally died closes a loop that runs through the entire summit. Fu was killed by Ao, the Kyurigakure censor, who fought with a Byakugan he had taken in battle years earlier. Sit with that for a moment. Danzo's whole scheme at the summit hinged on stolen eyes and eye-based deception. The borrowed Sharingan of Shisui hidden beneath the bandages. The dojutsu that let him bend the truth of a room. His entire strategy was built on a borrowed eye. So there's a quiet symmetry in the fact that Fu, Danzo's own bodyguard, met his end at the hands of another borrowed dojutsu, a Byakugan that wasn't Ao's by birth either. Stolen sight brought Danzo to that summit, and stolen sight is what struck down the man protecting him. The story rhymes with itself, and Fu sits right at the point where the two lines cross. There's a smaller detail in his design that carries just as much weight if you let it. Fu wears the standard route uniform and the plain mask that every one of Danzo's agents wears. The outfit built specifically to strip away individual identity. That's not a costume choice made for style. It reflects Danzo's core philosophy, the belief he drilled into everyone he raised in the shadows, that a shinobi should have no name, no emotion, and no self. Everything reduced to function. And this is where the accident of Fu's surname becomes almost unbearably pointed. The Yamanaka clan is known across the leaf for warmth, for family, for the flower shop, for a name that carries generations of pride. Fu comes from exactly that lineage, but Danzo took a boy from the clan of connection and dressed him in the uniform of erasure. So the one thing a Yamanaka is supposed to have, a name and a self worth passing down, is the one thing Fu was trained to surrender. That's the strange, lucky twist at the center of him. Not luck that helped him, but the accident of placement that decided everything he became. Had he grown up in the intelligence division beside Ino's family, the mind-body switch technique would have been a tool for understanding others. Instead, it became a survival mechanism for a man who had already given up his own identity. He entered the story quietly around chapter 458. He served as a shield during the retreat from Sasuke's ambush. He lent his mind to Torune's poison-proof body in the clan's most unusual application of its own jutsu, and he fell to Ao's borrowed Byakugan, one stolen eye answering another. A single Yamanaka, standing on the wrong side of his own family's name, remembered mostly for the darkness he was placed beside. And so we've wandered through the hidden corners of the leaf tonight, from Danzo's buried shadows all the way to Fu Yamanaka's quiet loyalty. Thank you for drifting along with me through these old stories, and I can feel sleep settling over you now, soft and slow. Let these tales carry you gently into the dark. Sweet dreams.